We'll move on to our next speaker now, which is Simon Archer. Simon has undertaken a residency at the University of Nottingham and is now full-time at the University of Nottingham, and he's going to give us a presentation on the impact of routine hormonal treatments for reproductive management of dairy herds. You can use that one.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pick up on a couple of comments we heard from before about the importance of using existing technologies to improve the health and management of cattle herds. And as we know, some technologies can be controversial. And I'm talking in this talk about using hormones to manage reproduction. So the aim of the talk is a simulation study is to predict the magnitude between herd variation for some hormone interventions. I've actually got a paper with 3 different interventions, but I'm only going to have time to talk about one of them today for the main points. And the outcomes that I'm interested in, changes in the methane emissions from herds, in addition to changes in production and economic efficiency associated with the intervention. So it's a simulation study, so I don't actually have any data, but what I do know is a good idea of what parameters for dairy herds should be and a realistic range for them that's come from a data set of about 300 well-recorded UK herds. And so all these factors that we can see, indices of measures from the herd, I've summarised as uniform flat distributions. So that's to say, for a particular herd, each parameter will take some value in this range. I'm not going to specify what it is, but if I want to pick a particular herd, I can draw at random within these ranges. And if I do enough herds, I'll probably cover a good idea of what's in the population. And I'm actually going to do 10,000 herds. So there's 10,000 herds in the UK. So if I do enough draws from these ranges, I should have a fair coverage of what's out there. So within each herd, I'm also going to simulate cows that are in the herd. So again, based on the data set that I've had, I can put them in a particular parity because I know what age structure there should be in the herds. I can start them calving at a particular month to have year-round systems, which is what I'm focusing on. I give them a milk yield. I can say, so how long after calving is it going to take for you to resume cycling? So what's the length of anestrus? I can give them this based on existing data from publications. And then once they do start cycling, how long are you going to cycle for in your normal reproductive cycle? So for each herd, I've got 10,000 of them. I'm going to simulate 200 cows, and I've just described the cow level data, like parity and their overall milk yield. I'm going to have some black box, which is going to have some calculations in that I'm going to talk a little bit about, but not too much. And when I've simulated a baseline situation for the cows under a situation of serving cows to observed estrus, I can use exactly the same cows and do my interventions and then look at the difference in the outcomes, the environmental and the economic outputs. So that's an advantage of simulation that you can't obviously do in real life. So within the cows, I'm simulating time. So I'm simulating 2 years on a daily basis for every cow, and there's 200 of them in 10,000 herds. And over time, they'll be on a particular day of the cycle, which will change, and there'll be some seasonal variation depending on where that is. And if it comes to the end of their cycle and they start another one, then they'll be deemed to be in estrus. And then there'll be a probabilistic process based on herd level data to say how likely it is, given that a cow is in estrus, that she will be served. So I can draw this, and at random, this will either be a 1 or a 0. And then, based on a model that will say, given that you're served, how likely it is that you're pregnant, I can draw, again, from that, from a binomial distribution, and get an idea if the cow is pregnant or not. And then I can do this process over time. If a cow gets to 300 days and she's not pregnant, I'll assume she's culled. And then I continue following them through over 2 years, mainly so I can get their milk yield, which I've calculated from some standard equations, because it's the difference in the milk yield. It's going to take an extended time to see that difference if there's a benefit in cost from improving fertility. So the scenarios that I looked at, so there's the baseline situation where cows are just served to observed estrus, and the one I'm going to focus on is an off-sync, just for the first service, and I'll describe that a bit more. I've also looked at a couple of other interventions that I'm not going to go into, but I've got a paper that I can refer you to for those details. So the off-sync program, so it's for the first service, so it's 2 injections of GnRH 9 days apart, prostaglandin on day 7, with a fixed time service, sort of 16 to 24 hours after the end of the program. And to make it a bit realistic, I'm going to say that this is done on a 2-weekly basis on the herd. So I took the decision that it's probably going to be unlikely that farmers are going to chase around to find every cow that is at exactly 50 days in milk to start. So they'll probably do it within a range of, say, 50 to 64 days in milk to start the program. So cows could then be treated from 40 days. So when I've put in place the off-sync, it's going to have an impact on the baseline situation, and based on published papers, I can estimate what that's going to do to the probability of conception given that a cow has been served. So it's going to increase the returns, the submission, so all cows are going to get submitted, 100% submission, but it's going to have a slight negative effect on the probability of conception given a serve that's summarized by a distribution that on average has an 80% reduction in the probability of conception from given a serve. And after the first service has been synchronized in this intervention, they're on their own. So that's to say they're back to the baseline scenario, and any returns they have to detect in estrus. So as well as looking at some economic outcomes, I looked at methane as an environmental outcome. And methane is essentially a function of the milk yield that I calculated and of herd turnover, or the replacement rate. And so to get to this, I had to have an estimate of the dry matter intake that was based on stage of lactation, and I assumed a simple diet, and it didn't really matter too much what it was, because it was going to be exactly the same for the baseline and the intervention situation. So what I did was just assume concentrate was fed for any yield over 10 litres per day. And methane production from the cow then essentially comes from forage, and I had an estimate of its quality in my initial herd level random effects. So after the simulation, I summarised the results with regression, and this is some plots of the results and the main factors that are influencing the average amount of methane that's produced in grams per litre of milk. So the main factors are shown on the axes of these 3D plots. So I've got the risk of cows being submitted for a serve, the voluntary waiting period, and then this methane is the outcome. And then I've repeated this for different levels of pregnancy risk. So what we can see is that where there's negative figures, that shows a reduction in the methane output per litre with the off-sync intervention compared to a baseline situation. So as you might expect, for herds with lower submission risk, doing something that improves their submission quite a lot is having a benefit. But there's also variability depending on where they are with the other parameters. And so for a herd in the UK, so average size would be 126 cows and about 7,300 litres of milk per year from those data there. So that would sit probably about in the middle of that plane there. So they're saving that amount of methane for an average herd if they went onto this intervention. And I've got here what that means in terms of cars. So that saving of methane would be equivalent to 2 cars over a year, a family home, or 21 barrels of oil. And that's for one herd. So there's also an economic benefit in some instances from these interventions that, of course, that farmers are going to be interested in. And again, we can see most of the economic benefit is going to be for herds that have a lower submission risk. But what we can also point out from these is herds where there may be less of a benefit that have a higher submission risk. But if we go back to the other slide, we can see actually some of those herds, although they might not have had an economic benefit, there may be an environmental benefit because of a reduction in methane. So what this means is there's variability between herds, and it's important to be able to take an individual situation and make predictions for that case to know whether we can recommend this technology, and both as an economic decision for the farmer, but also in terms of justifying it to consumers, because essentially if we can reduce methane emissions per litre of milk, then that is a public good from using what could be seen as a potentially controversial technology. So for more details, this work is published in PLOS ONE. And there are some conclusions that I've highlighted some of. So it's important to consider that the farms are very variable. This isn't going to benefit every farm. It's important to have predictions for specific situations and be able to justify an economic benefit of the interventions and identify where there might be savings in methane emissions. To this end, I've been working with Zoetis on making a spreadsheet-based tool to make these decisions. So advisors can go out and for individual farms and their data, it will be possible to do a simplified version of the simulation and work out where individual farms are in relation to the grander scheme of things and get a feel of economic and environmental benefits from the off-sync and some other interventions as well. So that's all I have. I'd just like to thank again Zoetis for funding the work, and I invite any questions.